Welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian book reviews brought to you by the Sci-Fi-Christian.com. I am Ben DeBono, here to talk to you about a few additional thoughts on Neil Gaiman's new novel, The Ocean at the End of the Lane. Now, I've already reviewed this novel, and I gave it 5 stars. I loved it, but I actually just finished reading it again, or rather listening to the audiobook version of it, so I've been through the novel twice now, and throughout the second reading, there was just so much that I thought about, that occurred to me, that I hadn't mentioned in the first review, that I thought it might be beneficial to come back and go ahead and offer a few additional thoughts to the Sci-Fi Christian audience on this novel that I consider to be, especially after 2 readings, an absolute masterpiece. This is a great, great book. And maybe where I should start is, I mentioned I listened to it this time around. And maybe I should start by talking a little bit to you about the audiobook version, which is read by Neil Gaiman. And I've heard him read, I think I heard him read Stardust. I don't think he reads the audiobook version of American Gods, which I've also listened to. And I'm not sure about Neverwhere, but for sure he reads Stardust, and he is a phenomenal reader. This is just 2 masterpieces meshed on top of each other almost. I don't know how do you quite express that, but you have the novel, which is brilliant, but then Neil Gaiman's reading, which is almost independently brilliant on its own. In fact, I'm going to do something that I almost never do, and that's recommend that if you're only going to read this book one way, you do it the audiobook. Go that route. Because in my mind, for as good as this novel is just as a novel, hearing it read, especially by Neil Gaiman, is such an exquisite experience that if you only have time to do one, and I'd recommend doing both. I'd recommend, reading it first, then going and listening to the audiobook like I did. But if you only have time to do one, do the audiobook, because it's that good of a performance. Usually I just use audiobooks for rereading, but this is the rare case, maybe the only case that I can remember, where I would say the audiobook is the superior experience. Go with that. So a few thoughts on the content of the novel as a whole that occurred to me as I was going through this second reading that I wanted to mention to you. I'm going to start with non-spoilery things, and then we'll maybe get a bit more spoilery towards the end. So, if you haven't read it yet, maybe just listen to the first couple of these and then turn it off and come back after you've had a chance to read the book. So the first thing is just a small thing that occurred to me is I wonder if it's possible that this novel could be set in the American Gods universe. I'd have to go back and reread American Gods to refresh my memory, but the Hemstock women frequently refer to themselves coming from the old country, which seems to my memory, and again I could be wrong on this, it seems to be a similar phrase to what's used in American Gods and the Nancy Boys to refer to where the gods originally came from. So it seems to me that it's possible, at least, that Neil Gaiman could tie this into the American Gods universe, which opens the possibility of could it become part of the American Gods HBO series that's set to debut in the next couple of years. Now, I realize that Ocean at the End of the Lane is already optioned for and being adapted by Joe Wright, I believe, is the director, the guy who did, I'm blanking on all the Keira Knightley movies or whatever. Atonement, that's the one I'm trying to think of. So he's working on the adaptation, so it's going to be a movie, and so that probably rules it out just from a legal rights point of view or whatever. But it's possible that I think you could finesse the story in such a way where you could make this a part of the American Gods universe. And that would be kind of an interesting way to do that series. You have the American Gods novel. Apparently, I think Neil Gaiman's either working on an American Gods 2 or something like that, or he's got a kind of a sequel material that's either going to be a novel independently or tied to the TV series anyway. So you've got at least a couple seasons there we'll say 3 maybe with all of that. But then you could also do another season on the Nancy Boys, or maybe another season on Ocean at the End of the Lane, and just kind of have a nice couple anthology seasons in there. So that would be interesting. Probably unlikely, but I think it would be cool to see that happen. Okay, so getting into some of the material in and of itself, I want to read you a passage, just a brief paragraph, that I think perfectly illustrates what the genius of this novel is. And you'll notice that this passage is not only spoiler-free, but it also is pretty ancillary to the plot. It doesn't really seem to have a lot to do with what's going on in the plot of this novel. At best, you could say that there's maybe some character development in here, but the genius of this novel is that here in this almost incidental paragraph that really doesn't have anything to do plot-wise with the book, I think we almost get the very heart of the novel. Okay, and I'll explain to you what I mean. So early on in the book, we have the relationship between the narrator and his dad, and we find out that his dad has this whole thing about not wanting to waste money because the family's financially strapped or whatever. So, that way that comes out a few times in the beginning of the novel is his dad will make toast and it will burn, and he'll want the kids and himself to eat the toast. We don't waste food, that type of thing. Okay, so then we get to this great paragraph in the midst of, after this whole dynamic has come up a couple times. So he says, "At home my father ate all the most burnt pieces of toast. 'Yum,' he'd say, 'and charcoal good for you, and burnt toast, my favorite,' and he'd eat it all up. When I was much older, he confessed to me that he had not ever liked burnt toast, had only eaten it to prevent it from going to waste, and for a fraction of a moment, my entire childhood felt like a lie. It was as if one of the pillars of belief that my world had been built upon had crumbled into dry sand." That's such a fascinating passage to me because it's, on one hand, it's funny. Some of Neil Gaiman's wit and whimsy come through in that passage. But on the other hand, it's like the entire thesis of the novel is right there. It's those moments that make you reconsider your childhood, that make you feel like it wasn't what you thought it was at one point. And there's such a genius to bringing that out in such a small thing, like your dad didn't really like these pieces of burnt toast. But the genius is also that I think a lot of us have those moments when we grow up, where it's such a small, incidental, absolutely meaningless thing, that our parents do something like that, but then we find out, and for a second it's like, oh my gosh, you mean that what I thought was true wasn't true, and it doesn't matter that it's this impossibly insignificant thing. It's that it feels like a part of our childhood that we took for granted and then we find out isn't true. So it's a very relatable moment as well. And to me, that's what this whole novel is trying to convey, is that sense of looking back on your childhood and reconsidering it through the eyes of an adult and trying to figure out what's really true about what I remember, but maybe also what feels untrue because I'm an adult that would be true if I could go back through the eyes of the child. So there's this whole dynamic of the relationship between childhood and adulthood that comes in throughout the book, and how those two mesh together, especially as an adult considering your childhood. And that moment that's so incidental to the plot and so meaningless and so small and insignificant captures that message perfectly. And that is the genius of this novel, is the way that even in those small moments of the books, it makes you think about that central message. Okay, moving on to, and these aren't necessarily going to be connected, all these thoughts that I have, in case you haven't been able to tell that already. I'm just kind of giving you a scatter shot of, if that's a word, of some of the thoughts that I had during this novel. So don't expect them to be necessarily connected as you're listening. Okay, so another thought. It would be interesting to see somebody do an analysis of the economics or an economic worldview present in Ocean at the End of the Lane. Because the subject of money comes up repeatedly throughout the novel. So we have the fairy person who turns out to be Ursula, who is giving money to people in an effort to make them happy. We have, at one point, the narrator gets a letter that some kind of bond that his grandparents have got for him has cashed out, and so now he has like 25 pounds. And so we keep getting these references to money that come back. And it's really fascinating because usually when an author wants to get into economics as part of his novel, you're going to get some type of critique or analysis of capitalism or socialism or some type of system like that. And I suppose you could probably draw something like that out of this novel. But I think more what Neil Gaiman is trying to get at is, again, how does that adult-childhood dynamic work in terms of finances and economics? I'll give you a perfect example. So I mentioned the incident where the narrator gets these bonds that his grandparents have bought him that cash out or whatever, and so he has 25 pounds. So he finds out about this, and he's thinking about it, and he's thinking of all the great candy and toys he's going to buy with these 25 pounds. And it's a very childlike view of money. And then his mother tells him, well, I'll put it in your bank account. Which, of course, is the smart thing to do, but it takes all of the magic out of getting these 25 pounds from these bonds. And so instantly this childhood sense of wonder, and what am I going to buy with this huge fortune from a child's perspective, is gone. And it goes into this adult, well, let's do the smart thing, let's put the money in the bank and let it collect. And again, this is something that I think we can relate to as adults thinking back on our own childhood, because, I'm an adult and I have a family and all this, and so I try and be smart about money, and, you try and save and think long term and all of this. And of course, there's a lot of wisdom in that. But then at the same time, I can remember as a child, the first time I ever had a $5 bill, and how having this $5 bill, that feels like you have all the money you could ever possibly need. And so there's this dynamic of Neil Gaiman through money and this discussion of economics, capturing that dynamic of, okay, what's the childlike view of money, what's the adult view of money, and how do we put those in conversation with one another? And it comes through really well later in the book in kind of a throwaway line, and I don't even remember the context of it. But I think the narrator's talking about how, people have grown up and they make money by moving money from one place to another, obviously talking stockbrokers or whatever. And so they make their money by moving all this stuff around, but they don't make it by actually producing anything. And it's presented in a way where this sense of making money kind of by hovering above the meta economy or whatever and manipulating it is seen as a tragedy compared to earning money through actually producing something and doing something worthwhile and making something with your hands and adding some value into the world rather than just kind of leeching onto the production and success of others. And I think that that's that same dynamic, but now viewed more from an adult perspective of, okay, where's the real economic value in money? Is it simply in having it and trying to create as much as possible, or does economic worth actually go into where that money is coming from? What value is being added in return for that money? And I think we get a bit of that childhood sense coming back as a critique of the adult world that wants to make money through not necessarily cheating and theft, though it can go that way, but even through just a lack of real labor, a lack of actual work and production, and that's presented as a tragedy. So I'm obviously not an economist, and I think it would be interesting to have somebody who has a bit more financial know-how than I do read this book and kind of take some of those dynamics and present some kind of interesting analysis on what Neil Gaiman's actually trying to say. But I at least want to throw the idea out there because it occurred to me that this is a theme that keeps coming up, and is a pretty fascinating one to actually get into and think about in the course of the novel. Okay, one more for you. One of the themes of the novel, I think, is that virtue taken too far, can be harmful. And that's really fascinating. And I think it's something that a lot of people who are reading this novel have missed, where they seem to take the message of this novel to be adulthood bad, children good. And it's not that simple. That's not entirely what he's getting at. Certainly, I talked in my first review about how I think that he kind of has that sense, that C.S. Lewis-esque sense of not wanting to be grown up, not in a sense of wanting to avoid maturity, but in the sense of wanting to be able to see the world through those childlike eyes. Very much the faith like a child teaching that we get from Jesus in the Gospels. Okay, so that obviously is a pretty clear-cut message, but that's different than simply saying, hooray for children, boo adults. That's too simplistic. Certainly this is a novel that has a great deal of admiration for childhood and for children and for the way that they view the world, no doubt about it. But it also is concerned about virtues, even the virtues of childhood, being taken too far. If you think about it, and this is where I'll probably get into the most spoiler territory of the video, so consider yourself warned. But if you think about it, a lot of the problems in this novel are caused by kind of a childish approach. Letty takes the narrator with her to go and take care of the fairy Ursula, who's giving everybody money. That's a childlike desire. She has an adult-like task to do, but she wants her friend to come along. Okay, it was a very childlike thing, and it's innocent and wonderful and celebratory, but it also causes all the problems that follow in the rest of the novel. And our narrator also, when they're out there, he's supposed to hold on to Letty's hand the whole time, but he gets this childhood sense of wanting to stand up and do something good and defend her, and it backfires and causes problems as a result of letting Ursula come into the world. But it's not just childhood that is kind of thrown to this dynamic. We also see it, to go back to the economics thing, with what Ursula is doing. Where she's giving people money and she's trying to make them happy, and it's a good thing and it's generous, but it's a virtue taken too far, and it winds up being problematic in terms of the plot of the story. So you get this whole thing that comes up again and again of what happens when virtue is isolated and then taken too far. And that to me is a really fascinating concept to think about, because it's something that, again, if we're honest with ourselves, all of us tend to do. We all have our pet issues or pet values that we really stress, and we tend to stress them at the expense of everything else that is right and good and just, and that we ought to be doing as responsible members of society or of the church or what have you. Okay? And I think that Neil Gaiman is interested in exploring that this is not simply this is not a simplistic novel that just wants to give you a basic message and we all say, yay, let's all go be more childlike, and that's it. It really wants you to think about, okay, we have these ideals that we've lost as an adult. We tend to lose this childlike nature, and that's tragic. But it's not as simple as just flipping a switch and then we get it back and then everything's good. I think he wants us to really engage in the process of thinking about, what does that mean? And what does that childlike virtue look like when it's taken in conversation with other virtues? What would happen if we just left it in isolation and took it too far? And then we'd have an equally problematic state as we have when we suppress it altogether. So it really gives you something to think about, and that to me is where the value of this novel is that it really causes you to think. It is not simplistic in its message, it's not simplistic in its themes. They're out there and they're obvious, but at the same time you have to really consider them if you want to get to the heart of what Neil Gaiman is saying. And that is the genius of The Ocean at the End of the Lane. So I would strongly recommend it. If you haven't had a chance to read it or listen to it so far, please go do so. You're not going to be disappointed. This is going to be one of the best books written this year. So, that's all for now. I am Ben DeBono, and this is Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews.